Chapter 3, out of the cooking pot and into the barbecue. Uh-oh, said Fishlegs. This was most definitely not a peaceful fishing boat. It was, in fact, a sizable Roman ship, 70 metres long from stern to prow. The sails were pure white and high above. When Hiccup craned his neck, he could see the Roman flag of the imperial eagle flapping cheerily in the wind. The boat was crammed with what looked like an entire legion of Roman soldiers who were now looking at Fishlegs with astonishment and fury. There was a gigantic iron cage set near the mast of the boat. An enormous number and variety of dragon species were being held prisoner behind the bars of this cage. Deadly nadders, flying gators, big spotted glormitises, yellow vampires, common or gardens, you name it, they were all there, trapped together in a furious tangle of tangled talons and wings and fangs, ready to be sent back to the restaurants and the shoemakers in Rome. Oh, for Thor's sake, whispered Hiccup. Roman dragon rustlers. I do not believe this. Ah, said Fishlegs with a nervous smile, backing towards the edge of the boat. I seem to have made some sort of mistake. This is the wrong boat, you see. He tried to laugh in an airy fashion. So sorry to disturb. Carry on with what you're doing, why don't you? The nearest soldier, who was a 6'5" centurion with legs like street tongues, drew his sword with a nasty flourish. And where do you think you're going? He asked Fishlegs in Latin. That's the language that the Romans used to speak. He put out a big hand to grab Fishlegs, and Fishlegs ducked under his arm in the nick of time. Get him! Yelled the big centurion, and 6 or 7 more soldiers made a leap towards Fishlegs. Now, if Hiccup had been a traditional Viking hooligan hero, he would have drawn his sword Endeavour and launched himself over to the side to the aid of his friend, shouting the hooligan war cry at the top of his voice. But then, if Hiccup had been a traditional Viking hooligan hero, he would have been dead as a kipper several books ago. A noble kipper, perhaps. A gloriously brave kipper, but nonetheless a very, very dead kipper. Instead, Hiccup sneaked over the edge of the boat as quietly as he could, as soft as a ghost. He hid behind a couple of jars of olive oil beside a bit of the deck that was covered by a large tent. In the meantime, Fishlegs was being chased by the Roman soldiers. The chase didn't last long. Fishlegs ducked and dodged as best he could, but finally ran to the stomach of a gigantic centurion who picked him clear off the ground. Look who we have here, bellowed the centurion, as Fishlegs kicked his legs like a stranded beetle. A scary little Viking trying to attack us all on his own. Oh, the other 349 soldiers thought this was very funny. This is all a big mistake, wailed Fishlegs, scratching himself violently as his eczema started coming out with the anxiety of the moment. Please let me go. Let's take you to the boss, little barbarian, said the centurion. He carried Fishlegs over to the tent where Hiccup was hiding. Hiccup peered out from behind his jar. Gently he drew back the curtain so he could see what was happening. That is Fishlegs in the middle of the gang of Romans. Can you see him just in the middle there? There he is, looking very anxious, quite rightly. Bright red in the face and trembling and itching, Fishlegs was brought before 2 richly dressed men reclining under the tent, just a metre away from where Hiccup was crouching. One of these men was very, very fat. So fat that parts of his stomach were dripping over the edge of his couch and were being held up by a small slave. Oh dear. The other man was thin and wearing a fancy helmet with a gigantic plume and a face guard that covered his face and his eyes. The fat Roman was eating nano-dragons in honey from a plate on a low table in front of him. Nano-dragons were a tiny species of dragon as numerous as insects. They were about the size of locusts. Oh, the poor creatures were still alive and were wriggling but unable to escape from the honey that gummed up their wings. Hiccup could hear their pathetic cries for help as the fat fingers picked them up and gobbled them down. The fat Roman was difficult to understand because he was talking with his mouth full. By Jupiter, roared the fat Roman through a big helping of nano-dragon. I do believe we've been attacked by a teeny wee little barbarian. That's the consul there. There's the consul, and there is the thin prefect on the other side. You can see. Oh yes, I do believe. So we have, Consul, replied the thin prefect. I recognise this one. He is a member of one of the local tribes I was telling you about. I'm worried that these tribes might object to our fiendishly clever plan. Oh yes, remind me what is our fiendishly clever plan again, asked the fat consul. 1. Disguise ourselves cunningly as hooligans and kidnap the heir to the British burglars. Marvellous, spluttered the fat consul. 2, said the thin prefect evilly, disguise ourselves cunningly as book burglars and kidnap the heir to the hairy hooligans. You're a genius, gurgled the fat consul. The book burglars and the hooligans are so busy fighting each other that they do not notice us stealing every single dragon in the inner aisles. Bravo! Shouted the fat consul. Hiccup would have loved to hang around and discover more about the plan, but he had important work to do. He had to get Fishlegs and himself off this ship alive. Luckily, although everyday life as a Viking was a big struggle for Hiccup, he always came into his own in a crisis, and this was a crisis. Hiccup quickly summed up the problem. On the other side, 350 of Imperial Rome's finest soldiers, armed with javelins, swords, spears, arrows, entrenching saws, etc., etc. On his side, 2 scrawny Vikings and 2 small dragons, 1 on strike and 1 in a coma. Yep, it was a crisis. Hiccup's eye was then caught by a tiny little electric squirm clinging to the edge of the curtain. He looked from the electric squirm back to the cage of the dragons. All that talk about distracting had given him an idea. Hiccup is good at ideas. Perhaps he could use the electric squirm to distract the Romans' attention so that he could tiptoe up and open the cage of dragons. The dragons would rush out and attack everybody, and in the confusion, Hiccup could rescue Fishlegs. Hiccup got out his handkerchief, wrapped it round his hand, and picked up the electric squirm very, very carefully by the tail. As its name suggests, the electric squirm gives a truly terrible electric shock if you touch it in the wrong place. The tail is fine because it's made of some sort of horny material that doesn't conduct electricity. Do you see the electric squirm? Oh, just there. There it is. That's the electric squirm. Yeah. So you have to be careful when you pick it up because it might give you an electric shock. Yes, the tail doesn't conduct electricity, but every other part of its body is likely to electrocute you. Hiccup dropped to his hands and knees and softly pushed aside the curtains of the canopy. The thin prefect and the fat consul were still deep in conversation. The fat consul had nearly finished his nano dragons and honey. Oh, that's yucky. There was only 1 nano dragon left on the plate, struggling to escape. No one was looking at it. All the 2 men were far too busy talking. Hiccup crawled forwards, reached up and removed the nano dragon, putting it in his pocket. At least he had saved one of the poor creatures. He replaced the nano dragon with an electric squirm, which was almost exactly the same size. Good plan. Hiccup then crept away towards the cage of dragons. Still talking, the fat consul reached out with 1 hand to grab another portion of nano dragon. His porky fingers scrabbled around in the honey for the final juicy morsel and closed around the stomach of the electric squirm. All 38 stone of the fat consul soared quite 1 metre in the air, and it jolly well serves him right for eating nano dragons and honey, in my opinion. His hair stuck up and out like a hedgehog. Sparks flew out of his ears, and his great blubbering mounds of flesh lit up with a strange blue light and quivered and shivered and wobbled and jiggled hysterically like a gigantic pink jelly that has been struck by lightning. A few seconds later, he fell to earth again. His toga turned to ashes around him, and the vast, flabby acres of his enormous stomach went on wobbling for the next 10 minutes. Whilst everybody's attention was being drawn to the fat consul doing a one-man impression of the Northern Lights, Hiccup quietly lifted the wooden bars of the dragon's cage. The next moment, there was pandemonium aboard the deck of the Roman ship as the dragons poured out in a furious, shrieking, snapping and flaming river of beaks and wings and talons and tails, attacking the Roman setting part of the sails and causing no end of damage. The thin prefect climbed on top of his couch in order to have a better view of what was happening. Hiccup, he said to himself under his breath. This is the work of Hiccup horrendous had it the third, or I am a freshwater crayfish, which I'm not, of course. Well, I'll flush you out of your hiding place, my fine fellow. You see if I don't. Centurion! This command was directed at the Roman soldier, who was still holding Fishlegs upside down by his left ankle. Prepare to execute the prisoner. The centurion drew his sword with a flourish and swung it up over his head. Hiccup! Screamed Fishlegs, absolutely terrified. This was not part of Hiccup's plan. Toothless! Screamed Hiccup. We'll have to find out what happens in chapter 4 tomorrow.